Today in this multi-podcast series, we're going to be talking to Wilfred Reilly, and we've arrived in Louisville, Kentucky, where Wilfred is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University. Wilfred has his PhD from Southern Illinois University, and he also happens to be an attorney. He's written a book called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. Let's welcome Wilfred Reilly to the program. Thanks for being a part of this. I think it's a great series. Kind of give us an idea of where you see the misconceptions of DEI, because everybody, you hear the term diversity, equity, and inclusion, sounds good on its surface, right? But when you start peeling back on it and what it sort of devolved into, I mean, I think people are starting to wonder, is this really the right way to go?
Yeah, I think so. What you're dealing with here is kind of the classic Mott and Bailey debaters trick, and people like James Lindsay and so on have done a good job of pointing this out, where nobody opposes the words diversity, equity, and inclusion themselves, but what's meant by those terms in context isn't just we're going to have a bunch of people of different ethnic backgrounds on staff or something like that. We've, I assume, both hired people, and that's not very difficult to do. Even if you wanted to do that along racial lines, I mean, I don't mean to be funny, but all you'd have to say is, get me 10 to 12% black guys. It's the work of a minute. Just like a college admissions office could be one guy with a spreadsheet who had the highest SAT score. Did they play sports? It would be very, very simple. But I mean, diversity, equity, and inclusion in practice comes out of a theoretical philosophy that I generally refer to as wokeism, but that you could more properly call critical social justice. And I think the idea there is pretty much threefold. So point one is sort of all of society is structured to oppress. And this is really classic when you talk to anyone on what you could call the woke left. It's canonical. Goes back to Delgado and Stefanczyk in the 1970s. It's what Ibram Kendi says on, I think, page 12 of How to Be an Anti-Racist. So things that it's really early on. But so things that might initially look kind of just fair and facially neutral, like there are tests you take to get into school. We have a justice system that is used to incarcerate, among other people, rapists and wife batterers. The idea is that those things, in fact, reflect and are primarily intended to serve this subtler purpose of oppressing minorities or something like that. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's all downstream from Marxism. Like, that's a cliche on the right, but it's also true. So like the Marxist idea, if you put aside the nonsensical economic theories about widgets and so on, is basically that society is an illusion. Like everything that looks facially neutral is in fact structured by this one group of people, the upper bourgeoisie, to oppress everyone else, the lumpen proletariat, the proletariat. So again, everything you see, property law, reflects the interests of rich people. And every other kind of critical theory, I think, is just a lower IQ riff on Marxism. So in critical race theory, the rich man is replaced by the white man. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so that idea is part one of wokeness, society structured to oppress. Part two, I think, is really the key, which is that all gaps you see in performance are due to this oppression. And this is the core point of like Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, all these people. And they say this very openly. Like when you see a gap in performance between two groups of people, like whites and African Americans, that can be due to either racism or genetic inferiority. And the problem with that is that sounds really sophisticated and intelligent, but it's just not true. Like the average white male, the modal white male, it's not, there are many ways to do an average, but is 58 years old. The modal black male is 27. So unless you equalize for that kind of thing, even at the mean, it's what, a 12-year difference? I'm sure people in the room know it. So unless you equalize for that, saying that there's a higher crime rate for blacks or a higher rate of wealth for whites or something, you haven't found anything about racism or inferiority. All gaps in performance indicate discrimination. And that is a serious point. And point three, though, I think that's where we really get into DEI. The solution is equity. So the solution is just proportional representation regardless of performance, which is what equity means. So like I looked at this MIT data. They recently, affirmative action at the collegiate level, at least large boost affirmative action, just been shot down, obviously, fair admissions. And MIT is actually a pretty honest school, and they release their data by race and test score and so on every year. And they just did it for this year, and the black student percentage dropped from, I think, 16% to 5%. The Hispanic population dropped from 16 or 17% to 11%. The Asian population increased dramatically. It's up around 50% now. I don't think that surprised anybody. And the white population didn't move at all. And what that indicates, of course, is that you weren't really hurting whites. You were taking Asians, and you were taking those slots away
and displacing.
You're giving them to non-Asian minorities, or NAMs, as we say in higher education. But in a weird situation there. But the idea of equity is how you get to 16% black at MIT. It's the idea that if you have 16% blacks in the youth cohort in society, that's what every college should look like. And almost every college I know is, in fact, striving for that.
Yeah.
So if you think that the only reason that women and men could play disparate roles in society is sexism or objectification or something like that, then it's a real problem that the Marines aren't 50% female.
Right.
And so the military is doing all this outreach now to aggressive women. They're recruiting at rugby clubs and so on. And I don't know if they're going to get to 50% female snipers, because I think men are more interested in killing people.
They're actually profiling women. They go to rugby clubs.
Well, I assume you wouldn't go to like a knitting circle and ask people if they want to be Marines.
Why not? If we're going to be fair about it, we should include the knitting ladies for the Marines. Well, one point I want to make about this, and then we'll continue, obviously, going and delving into the book, is I think we do a disservice because that strife. In other words, if you said to me, Kevin, you can't get into MIT because you can't make it, there are certain people that would drive you to say, I'll make it. I'll show you. So we've sort of beat the I'll show you guy out of it by saying, no, you can't make it, so I'm going to let you make it, which I do, got to get in, but then I find out I'm really not qualified because I didn't work as hard as that Asian kid who deserved it.
Yeah, there's a great book about this called Mismatch, where the authors, who are, I think it's a white liberal and a biracial liberal guy, it's a well-known social science text, they're very sympathetic to affirmative action. I think they are a little bit on the center right. But the whole point of the book is that if you look at affirmative action students in law school, for example, they're mismatched with institutions. So the thing about the American racial group competition is that none of the groups are doing embarrassingly badly. And black Americans in particular could pretty easily improve. I mean, but if you look at like the World PISA boards, the competitive achievement tests taken across countries, black Americans last year beat Greece. Like, it was just one normally performing group. We were just behind white and Asian Americans. Hispanic Americans about on the black par. So again, I don't think there's anything genetic or unchangeable there. Like, if you gave black people the message, look, the Civil War was a long time ago, why don't you guys study as much as Asian kids do? I think you would see many black people that are genuinely qualified for MIT. But what you're seeing right now is this mismatch effect, where, and I guess getting to the point, the authors looked across law schools. And one of the things I was going to note there is that the average black LSAT is, I think, 142, 144. That's not embarrassingly bad. So almost all of the people that got into law school, like got in, only half the people get in, were qualified to go to some law school. Mm-hmm. The issue is just you were taking the guy that should have gone to Central Michigan and sending him to Harvard.
Right.
Like, I mean, a 10-point boost on the LSAT is insane. So you're taking guys with 156s and putting them in lower Ivy colleges, and almost all of them were suffering as a result of that. The bar passage rate for these affirmative action students was something like 50%. And that, I think, is the dark secret of affirmative action, because a lot of people worry. You hear all this talk online about, like, what if the pilot's Hispanic? Will the plane crash? That ain't the way it works. Like, Delta's not letting you in the cockpit. The problem is that in these ruthless professions, you're going to take these people and you're going to send them to these schools that they barely scraped into as a result of affirmative action. And when they get out, they're going to find very often that they probably shouldn't have been in that school in the first place.
Right.
And also that because the competition was so fast-paced that they were barely keeping up, they're less prepared than they would have been had they gone to, for example, Central Michigan.
So, Wilfred, we've heard quite often about the 1619 Project. I don't want to get into the bowels of it and how it all got started and all that, but it was the notion of it is that the country was founded on racism, and that racism still exists today. Now, I know where I stand on it. I haven't seen the racism of the 1619 Project or anything associated with the way people see DEI today in my lifetime. I've seen a few people do stupid things, okay, but I would not call it systematic. I think there are many aspects of the systematic injustice that affects people of all colors, all races, all creeds, et cetera. You could say it disproportionately affects somebody else because maybe as blacks, we have more contact in the criminal justice system than, say, Asians. So, yeah, you could say, well, it's unfair and it's unfair to blacks. But if we look at the numbers empirically, we find out, no, it's probably disproportionately not impacting us the way we are. So, and I'm not going to debate the numbers at this point. But using that as a backdrop, I see the dog whistle of America's racist. You know, that's what we'll hear from our black brothers and sisters.
This is where affirmative action also has an impact. I don't like affirmative action in part because it makes people think black businessmen are unqualified or black business people.
Absolutely.
So the reality is, like, one of the things that was found in a famous list experiment study by a guy named Gaddis, who's actually a good professor, solid guy, I've argued with him online. But one of the things he found is that people are as likely to hire a white guy from Michigan as a black guy from Yale. Now, as a Big Ten graduate, I mean, I personally think I'd rank Michigan ahead again. What's the difference? 8 points or something? But, like, people are terrified, angry about this. And the obvious point is that a white guy from Michigan or Michigan State probably has the same basic SAT profile as a black guy from Yale, because there's an enormous affirmative action edge. So you're talking about like just a solid 1,400 in both cases.
Right.
So just ignoring that and saying, well, no, it's just racism. Why? I'm not convinced.
So Wilfred, the book, Lies My Leftist Teacher Told Me, which I think is an intriguing title. And my first book was The Big Black Lie and How I Learned the Truth About the Democratic Party, which is along the same lines, you know, growing up in America being told this is the way you should think, you should be as a young black man. And then I'm living in a world where I'm seeing the reality of my world and I'm going, that doesn't work for me. That doesn't fit. I'm not sure if that, I mean, you've got a varied background, obviously a very intellectual on the subject, but what led you to the book? I mean, obviously you did get some things that were revealed to you by your leftist teacher, but give us a little bit of a backdrop of what made you decide to write it.
Yeah, so the book itself, it's lies my liberal teacher told me. We decided that'd be broader than just leftist, but I agree with you. But the basic idea, so I'll actually just go into kind of the dinner party pitch for the book.
Sure.
So the basic motivation for the book was that I noticed, because I'm a person who reads, that over the past really 30 years, there's been a whole genre of books that have done two things. One is present Western society as the worst culture in history, and two, act like they're revolutionary for doing so. Like, I mean, if you read through college textbooks, there are all these snarky little sidebars, like you probably don't know a whole lot about feminism yet, you know? And that's where the whole idea of woke comes from. Like, you're the person who's aware of what's going on in the world. Everyone else is asleep. They're still in the matrix. You are not. By the way, you notice that the hard right, I mean, I think we're all in the right, center right, but like the hard right, they do this too with the whole idea of being based or actually being freed from the matrix. So if you actually listen to, say, Andrew Tate, anyone like that talk, it's all about, like, yeah, I took the red pill. Now I see what society is. And like anytime someone starts yammering about this kind of BS, you should have some questions. Right. But anyway, getting back to the point. So a whole series of books that did these two things, and it really is a whole series. I mean, there's Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, just bluntly 500 pages claiming the American historical and political science curriculum is just jingoistic racism, and doing what the left always does, which is citing these older sources in support of that. Yeah. Like people, what you call low counters, like people 50 years ago claiming there were very few Indians in North America. Now, that's not his whole book, but I mean, that's okay, that someone said that's probably not true. But I mean, you've got 1619. They just dropped a book 2 years ago. It's, what is it, a new origin story for our country? For God's sake. You know, the Indian books, you feel more sympathy for these brothers, but I mean, there's Vine Deloria's Custer Died for Our Sins. There's, I believe a chief's son, I forget his name, wrote Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, a native history of the United States. The interesting thing about this native history is that it's mostly composed just of Native American defeats. And the guy seems to have left out all the victories. So you wonder why the war took 400 years as you read through the book. It's just tragedy from 1600 to like 1910 when they finally surrendered. I mean, there's a lot went on in that interregnum there, including a lot of happy marriages and normal interaction, by the way. But anyway, just the whole genre of this stuff. And I decided to respond to it because the reality is that the U.S. hard right is not in control of culture, obviously. Everyone watching this is aware of that. So when you see these kind of claims, like people on network news saying, you know, my latest publication is just an attempt to fight back against the constant white supremacy we see in media, you should be pretty skeptical. I mean, my thesis starting the book was that when I read through the leading high school and collegiate textbooks in the country, I'd find that they were pretty good, but they had sort of a center left to left slant, and they would contain a lot of things that aren't factually true. And those things would be supported by the surrounding kind of mainstream media. And that's pretty much what I've found. Like, the book itself isn't all that partisan, if partisan at all. But I mean, like, one of the lies in the book is Native Americans were peaceful people who spent all day dancing and making love. Like, it's just, that really is. There's a release on Native Americans. There's a whole curriculum now on Native Americans from, I think, the U.S. Department of Ag that reads like it was written by the screenwriters for Pocahontas. So, I mean, it's just literally like the sky was full of birds, the sea was full of animals, never was life taken without need, marriage was based on love. And it's just sort of like, I don't know about all that. You know, and so I actually look at Native American history and I talk about what the great native tribes and nations were doing. Like the Aztecs had a European or Asian level of sophistication, but they also ate people. That seems notable. Like when the Spanish fought the Aztecs, both sides wrote about it. And this is one thing to remember about history. Like, people were literate. If you want to know what went on in ancient Rome, you can just read what they said. Right. You know, did the Romans encounter Africans? Well, you can read what they and the Ethiopians said about it. They fought 2 wars, as I recall. But anyway, so the Aztecs use a kind of pictorial script, as I recall. But the Spanish wrote books. Bernal Diaz wrote a book that still stands up pretty well today called The Conquest of Mexico. And the original assumption, I think, on the political left over the past 40 years has been that these were so dark and terrifying that they couldn't be real. Like when Diaz talks about fighting in the Aztec capital, there were like towers of human skulls and pyramids to temples to what he called devils with priests wearing capes made out of human skin and so on. And it turns out that was all true. Like, we found archaeological evidence of it over the past 20 years. And after a few attempts at kind of repressing it, the Mexican government has just said, okay, we're a warrior people, whatever. So now they're excavating the Tower of Human Skulls, like where it was. And ironically, it's under a cathedral. So, I mean, you can't help but feel that a group of Caucasian and Native people tearing that thing down and then building a church is an example of social improvement. But I mean, like, there's a lot of complex stuff like that in history.
Well, one of the things that I saw this, I think it was a Comanche, and he I think he's passed away, but he talked about, he goes, we were a warring tribe. He goes, we conquered all kinds of other Indians. And he goes, and when these guys came and beat us, we were like, dadgum, here's somebody that's tougher than us. So, but he goes, we have to tip our hats to them. We don't look at it as like these oppressive white people. We looked at it, here's a tribe that beat us up the way we've been beating up all these other tribes. And I thought, what a revelation. Because you're right, you're taught that it was all peace, love, and harmony, when in fact it was very different. It was people taking over tribal lands.
I think that, so how to phrase this, I don't want to get into a philosophical rant, but we can probably do a minute on this. I think that Americans are born with the luxury of believing that morals are real. And there are some
That's an interesting way to put it.
There probably are some that are, in the sense that anything is real to humans. You find the 10 Commandments are very similar to the Eightfold Way. You know, don't eat people is pretty universal across most societies and accounted for a lot of the disgust with the Aztecs. The Spanish found they had a lot of allies when they arrived in their boats. Tribes would just come up to them with 10,000 warriors, like we couldn't quite take them before.
Maybe this time.
Yeah. But I mean, beyond that, beyond things like don't rape tribeswomen or don't eat people, and I don't mean either of those glibly. There are 10 rules like this. Don't murder your parents. Most rules, like don't torture enemies after battle, are just things we made up relatively recently. Yeah. Most people, most human males certainly, do not feel any compassion toward defeated enemy warriors. I don't really myself. I view it as an improvement of my personality that is externally imposed that rule exists, and I follow it. I mean, I would hope our soldiers do in the field and so on. Sure. But that sort of thing was not the case throughout most of history. And people need to understand that throughout most of history, what you could call the old rules prevailed, where people were kind enough among one another, but where the basis of morality was, do you know what the Viking 9 noble virtues are?
I do not.
Okay, it's stuff like bravery, hard work, that kind of thing. Throughout most of history in civilized societies, so in Japan with Bushido, in Rome with the Stoics, in the Viking lands, among the Iroquois Indians, so these are fairly civilized people. Savages, bluntly, didn't have that much of a moral code in many cases. But in these societies that we're talking about, the basis of pre-Christian morality was the idea that to be good was kind of to be good at it, to develop the things that make you a sophisticated adult human and not a burden or a leech on anyone else. So you were brave, you were hardworking, you were honest, you were a good warrior, that sort of thing.
So virtues.
Yes, and there were two other additions there. One was what libertarians now call the non-aggression principle, which is that outside of war, you shouldn't just attack others. I think that was pretty universal. The Iroquois flexed that a little bit. But anyway, and the second was that there was some kind of tithing in almost every society. You were expected to give 5 to 10% to those that had nothing. So you had develop the virtues, give a little bit, and don't just attack people. And that was it. And there was nothing beyond that. Like if you fought a reasonably honorable war with someone and you beat them, you took all their stuff. There was no reason not to. It's not natural to humans not to. In modern society, we have a different moral system that you could call empathy-based morality. And I think this can be stretched too far and become what I call prey morality, like where you are concerned about nothing in terms of being honorable, in terms of being strong, skilled. Virtue becomes having suffered more or being least potentially harmful to other people. But, I mean, without going into this whole philosophy class, I mean, I guess the basic point would be that throughout history, almost no one outside of some hardcore Christian and Buddhist priests followed the empathic moral system.
Well, let me segue that into this, because it's where it's got my head going.
Okay.
Using that as an example, I see us applying the Christian values to this fight that we're in with DEI, and the other guys saying, we don't have to have any virtues. And we can use whatever principles we want to get these new ideas across in this so-called, because there's a war inside of DEI. We all believe, going back to the morality of it, in diversity, equity, and inclusion as it's written. Who doesn't? But I'm also smart enough to realize that we're two different men. There's no equity ever.
Of course not, yeah.
Because it's never, and we can parse equality, equity, call it whatever you want. It doesn't exist because we're two different. We could be twins and it doesn't exist. So, but I see what you were just saying, and I'm juxtaposing that to this present DEI war where there are no rules on the other side.
Well, I think that you said something really interesting there when you said we're applying Christian virtues. I think that traditionally what Christianity did, and I'd argue also Buddhism, but I'm a Westerner.
Well, yeah, but other aspects of it.
Yeah, but what Christianity did was add empathy to the list of traditional virtues, which is basically good. So, I mean, the traditional virtues were the virtues that made you an independent warrior, homemaker, or thinker. Now, the Christians said, well, we're going to boost the tithing from 5% to 10% or whatever, and we're going to care a little more about others because Jesus said to. And in the context of the other virtues, that's totally tolerable, and in fact, it's good. This is, I think, the mistake Nietzsche made, where he thought that all organized virtue systems, other than like go get them, were bad. No, I think the Christian combo we just discussed is pretty good, potentially even better than what it comes from, potentially. But what prey morality is abandoning all the other virtues and just going with empathy. And I think that there's a lot of writing about this. It's also been called slave morality. Yeah. But the basic idea when people criticize this, the basic idea of this moral system is kind of that you are helpless. So the original moral system has been called master morality, but a better term would probably be yeoman morality. The assumption is that you're an individual free person and you're able to do things for yourself, like practice your craft. And if you fail at your craft, we'll give you enough not to starve. That's your problem. Go become a better blacksmith. This is how I still feel today. It's how most people still feel today. The Christian empathic system just basically says, okay, give a little more and God exists. Good. Yeah, okay, cool. No one's really got beef with that either. The pray moral system is, how would you even sum it up? We are unable, by and large, to help ourselves. So what matters is working together to help others and obtain equal outcomes for others, or something like that. And the idea that basically we're just getting into communism here. There's no reason for me to keep rambling. The idea is everyone deserves about equally. That's what you get to. Right. And no one has to do much to get what they deserve. Those are the two principles. So you reject the traditional virtues, which enable you to compete successfully, and then you argue that everyone still deserves what they want. And that's why you get some of these look on Twitter sometime at these ludicrous debates, like, as a man, is it okay for my girlfriend to demand that I have a job? Like, just complete nonsense, where the idea is that abuse is anyone telling you to do anything. But basically, throughout history, the idea that all people were equal was a fringe, occasional idea. I mean, it's in the Declaration of Independence in the United States, but I mean, we were the first large modern democracy. I mean, even then, most countries had kings at that time. So, I mean, as you said, women couldn't vote until 1920. And by the way, that's just part of a long progression of different people getting the vote. I mean, blacks couldn't vote until 1865. Natives didn't get the vote until later, as I recall, so on down the line. So I guess there's a point to be made about history and then a point about DEI. So first of all, to look at history through the lens of today's upper middle class is just nonsensical. Right. I mean, when you say, well, George Washington had slaves and he had bond servants and he killed people in war, well, that's what you did as an upper class man at that time. That's like criticizing someone today for eating meat. I mean, I'm not drawing a direct analogy, but it's something you could morally argue with that was universal in the society at that time. If you were a defeated enemy and someone chose not to kill you, you became a slave. That's what it was. Everyone knew this. I mean,
made you fight harder.
Yeah, it did. There's actually a famous Chinese parable about that. You know, why do we allow enemies to give up and go home? Well, because if the only other options are death or slavery, everyone fights to the death. You know, so they're actually moral rules evolved for a reason, which is interesting to think about in evolutionary terms. But I mean, so historically, you know, you can't criticize George Washington unless you're also willing to criticize Shaka Zulu, Muhammad. I mean, the Khans in China and Mongolia, every other historical figure that existed. Martin Luther King has recently been implicated for, plagiarism allegations. He had a number of mistresses. He allegedly threw sex parties. I have no idea whether that's true or not. But I mean, like, are we going to see a feminist cancellation of Dr. King in 12 years? I mean, I don't think we should. I think the idea that everyone should be judged by the standards of a dorm room today historically is pretty illogical. But in terms of DEI, I think DEI is based on an idea of equality. It's just a perverted or a corrupted idea of equality. So the DEI idea is that everyone would perform equally if the devil didn't exist, kind of. It's like without racism / sexism / classism / whatever your boogeyman is, everyone would do exactly the same on every test. So when we see people not doing the same on tests, we know the boogeyman's in the room. You know, how do we stop the boogeyman? And so the solution is to do these stupid things. It's mass affirmative action, which we've talked about.
From your perspective, where do you see this going? How do we push back? How do you push back? And do you see it the way I see it, which I see a slow movement back in the other direction?
Well, I think I'm actually thinking of this from kind of a business consulting perspective, because I think that, obviously that's something I do as a sideline. A friend of mine, Brooks Crenshaw, a former Navy, not a SEAL, but a guy who worked with the teams overseas and started his company, is actually interested in doing anti-DEI consulting, which is something Chris Rufo's also mentioned. I think it's just an obvious sort of downturn, right-sizing sector for businesses. So I'll actually give a pretty professionally qualified answer here. One, where I see this going right now is pretty significant pullback. I mean, people are actually, what had to be done in a lot of these sectors, and our focus here isn't really gender ideology, although that's definitely an example, but certainly, let's say, affirmative action, where the fair admissions guys really got those differences in scores between, over here you've got natives, blacks, and Hispanics. In that order, by the way, blacks are by no means last. But then you've got whites, solid 1,100, and then you've got Asians, 1,250. And by the way, just to repeat, those are the average SAT scores. So like when you are a teacher or an executive at a college, you're dealing with 3 different incoming student populations. This probably doesn't matter as much at like the University of North Dakota, where you've got 85% Caucasians, you've got a majority of males, everyone's a traditional student. But I mean, like, if you're a Temple or something like that, your average black guy, Latino guy, or native guy is going to come in with about a 960, let's say. The average white guy is going to come in with an 1,100 or an 1,110. That's a 150-point difference. And your average Asian guy is going to come in with a 1,230 to a 1,250. That's a 140, 150-point difference. So how do you teach to those different populations of students? It's real hard. So I think as people become aware of figures like that, there's not just like a thumb on the scale for, qualified black guys who also used to play some quarterback. This is a 150-point edge. People are pulling back from this. The DEI is becoming dramatically less popular. Departments are renaming themselves things like departments of diversity like they were in the 90s. So you're seeing that in business. You've probably seen that. Sure. The flip side of this, though, is I'm pessimistic about that because I think that what matters is the existence of institutions. So the problem with DEI isn't, I think a lot of people sometimes get too caught up in this, I think people sometimes get too caught up in this, is this critical theory or is this a post-Hegelian? Like people having these academic conversations about what's going on. I mean, I think if you're talking about unsayable pundits, I think it was Steve Saylor who said what a lot of people mean by equity is the equity in your house. Like there's a very basic, simple idea here, which is that we want to set up these institutions that will compete with you guys and that will redivide the money in the country. And getting to the point, like a lot of these exist. So, I mean, most colleges now have a diversity office. Yeah. Michigan's employs 106 people.
Yeah, I was explaining at the time when I wrote my book, they had 93 people and their payroll was 10.2 million for those people.
Well, it's 106 now, brother. Yeah. I mean, so it's their payroll is so high because they view it as kind of insulting to pay a black employee less than $100,000. Now, I like that attitude. I mean, bring me on as a director or something, 300K. I'm with it.
Power to the people.
But like all banter aside, I mean that's very common at large colleges. Yeah. You see the same at Tennessee. I mean, in Kentucky.
But some of those are being dismantled. I think we were talking about the University of Kentucky is now going the other way, right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. So we've seen a win here in Kentucky, at least if you're anti-DEI, where the entire office, which I had 50 plus employees, I believe, is being shut down. So that's a battle that's going on. But the reality is that this exists around. You have to do something about the groups. Like once you set up an organized bureaucracy, it's very hard to get rid of. I remember once there was a golf scramble of some kind. This is just after I got to Kentucky. And one of the guys that was there, I wasn't playing, a guy I know, LG, who used to work for my university was. And one of the guys in his foursome was from the Tennessee Valley Authority, if I recall correctly. Yeah, and I talked to him briefly, and I was like, didn't you guys electrify the South in the 30s? Are you still around? He was like, yeah, bureaucracy don't go anywhere. The name has changed slightly. This is a true story. I mean, so it's just, there might be some detail. It's their office under somebody now. But it's the same thing, like Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push still exists, $50 million a year. Al Sharpton's National Action Network still exists. You can Google these. The first hit for any of those searches will be that entity. Sure. That firm is how I think of it. So anyway, similarly, you have the departments of diversity throughout corporate business, 2% of budget in a lot of companies. You have the diversity offices on campus. So I think what we have to prevent is DEI, not just DEI, the whole idea of critical theory, the Title IX stuff governing the most basic aspects of dating on campus, the queer theory stuff. What we have to prevent is that just retrenching, like going quiet every 4 years under a DeSantis or something like that, and then coming back because only 2 people out of the office of 85 were ever fired. That's the worry. How do you do that? I think that one of the most basic solutions is just to ban certain things. Like the Supreme Court, when it comes to affirmative action, large boost affirmative action in college admissions, just said you can't do that. Yeah. They're going to try to cheat a little bit with, stories about your past experiences or something. But, I mean, even with all that, MIT's down to 6% African Americans, and they're all qualified. So I mean, that's what's probably going to be required, like law. I would recommend that whites start suing. I hate to recommend that anyone take on lawyers in this country.
The Asians did for Harvard.
That's right. And I think that's one reason that case was so successful. Like, it's pretty easy to point at a blonde Harvard applicant who still got into Chicago and say, like, come on, you're not oppressed by anybody. Like, okay, so the equally rich black kid got in instead. Who cares? It's a little more difficult to say that with, like, the Vietnamese son of a San Francisco fisherman. Yeah. So, I mean, I think Asians should continue to sue. But I also think, the state that we're in right now, Kentucky, is like 91.2% white. And it's not rich, and it's not particularly low crime. So the idea of whites as one thing, blacks as the other, that's a class narrative that's being superimposed on race. And I'll tell you, it'd be nearly impossible for any of these Kentucky mountain kids to get into the Ivy League. That's why J.D. Vance is sort of a mythical figure. I mean, of hate on the left and of affection on the right. And he wrote a book about this called Hillbilly Elegy. And by that point, he wasn't vice president. The whole theme was just like, I got into Yale. Right. Okay? Right. But I mean, that's because it's so incredibly difficult to do. So if you feel you're being discriminated against to the tune of 200 points, get a lawyer. I mean, I think it's going to take courts. I think it's going to take governors, people actually saying, like, look, you can't do some of this. Yeah. I just think that if you have a law that says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, you can't discriminate on the basis of race. In terms of what can people do, when you said speak up, I think people often say that as though it's kind of a minor thing. Isn't there more I can do? No, I think that the most important thing that people can do is actually just express how they honestly feel about a lot of this when they're in power positions that would be difficult to remove them from, as in fact I am now. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I never know. We could see, depending on what sort of interviews I do. But like, I mean, just the reality, though, the emperor has no clothes is a famous parable for a reason. Sure. Because in the scenario, everyone knows the emperor is naked. There's no one that actually thinks he's wearing fine velvet. In fact, people are trying to interpret what he's supposed to be wearing differently, just like people do with all the critical theory nonsense. And finally, one little kid says, well, he's naked, and then immediately everyone says, oh, yeah, he's naked. And I find that happens a lot when I hold these ideas up to actual critical review from other conservative academics or just from a group of, like, more than a few ordinary people. So, I mean, like, I do a lot of large-end polls on social media. I have about 100,000 Twitter followers, and you can link to SurveyMonkey and that kind of thing pretty easily. And I've asked, like, groups of 3,000 or 4,000 people, like, do you think your black friends in the middle class are oppressed? Or do you believe America is a white supremacist patriarchy? Yeah. Like, I asked that to my Twitter account and the link people, and I have kind of a bro, quote-unquote, following, unsurprisingly. But, like, everyone's feminist girlfriend or wife is on the page. I expected it would be, like, 30% of the population that said, yeah. No, it was, like, for that one, it was under 10. I mean, for some of those that I've just mentioned, one of them very famously was 2%, which actually got mentioned in some articles in the actual media. People looked at that and just said, oh, almost no one actually believes this, eh? And I think that when you bring up some of this stuff, you'll find that that's usually true.
To your point, if you ask one, maybe two pointed questions, you pretty much dismantle the argument. So whether it's America's a racist country, and my response would be, and this is an easy one, is, well, then how did they elect a black president, right? I mean, pretty easy to say that. Or why are there so many successful black people? Your turn, right? So I think it really can be that simple. Now the question is, are we going to engage? I think a lot of people are afraid to engage in these discussions because they tend to spiral out of control, and the cancel culture will jump you quickly. And to your point, if you're protected, if you got a job, you got tenure, nobody's going to bother you, then you're fine. But I think a lot of people are afraid to have those conversations. I'm glad we're having this one because I think it will open people's eyes up that are following Goldwater, and hopefully we'll gain something from it.
Yeah, can I make one more comment there?
Absolutely.
I understand that people are afraid of cancel culture. So I also have a piece of advice for the managers and executives and so on out there, which is be aware that cancel culture is driven by a tiny fringe minority of people. And again, I don't want to just keep going back to quantitative data, but that sort of is my wheelhouse. That's the thing I do, whether it's very seriously or at some of this playful stuff online. But I mean, recently across social media and to some extent in actual media, this again produced a couple articles, there was this frenzied discussion. This Christian husband who runs like a marriage blog or something said he gave a bunch of tips for marriage, and one of them was just ask your wife for 10 things she'd like you to do around the house and then start doing them. And this seemed to be the most mundane imaginable advice. But it started this feeding frenzy online because all of these people, most of whom were feminist activists, started retweeting this and saying things like, you should already know what to do around the house, you man. And this, I mean, like hundreds of thousands of people. And I thought they had a bit of a point, but also just that, like, the asking someone for a honey-do list, which, you know, is extraordinarily common, is not something that actually offends anybody. So again, I just asked about this. I did the usual setup, like several thousand people answered. And the question was just like, do you view this as anything offensive or anything that would take away from your emotional labor or any of the terms that are being used? And among women, it was 17-1. No, this is a good thing I would welcome. You know, I have my own routine. I don't just want my man coming home and starting to do things and throw my canvases away. And among men, it was like, well, there were some complaints about nagging, but I think it was 76-5. No, this would be welcome. Would
want to know exactly what you want to do.
Yeah, but it was like, I'd also like her to do some of the outdoor stuff. Like, everyone agreed that this normal thing was normal. Just like everyone agreed their black buddies from the college varsity are not oppressed. Just like everyone agreed that America is not a white supremacist country. So when you see cancel culture, what you're seeing is the equivalent of the people that were retweeting this or writing magazine articles about it and saying, like, this is what it's like to be a woman in New York today. You're seeing this very small marginal group of angry people. And on social, as a guy who, like I said, has a podcast, has a large presence media account, I noticed that a lot of these people, like, it's not even multiple people complaining, it's one person with 8 identities. It's like, if you know anything about IP tracking, you send them a message, but you send them a message like, why are you following me? And you suddenly realize, like, all of these are the same person. Yeah. This person's a nut. Like, we've been driven in our public policy for a decade by the craziest fringe of society. Cancel culture, to some extent, depends on normal people letting ourselves be canceled. Like, if some guy in a café jumping around screaming at the sky is calling your boss should just block that number. Yeah. That doesn't reflect anything in society at all.
The problem is, it does impact people. It personally impacted me when I got fired from Fox. There was tons of bot traffic. We didn't know it. I mean, it was in our social media feed. And when they did an analysis of it, it was 98% bot traffic, not even actual people. But to your point, it's a minority that was actually there, but they get together and they can figure out how to destroy you. And people have lost jobs over it. I don't want to oversimplify it, and I understand the greater point, and I agree with you, by the way. Listen, what an insightful commentary, and on so many different topics. I think people will really get a lot from your work, and I hope they will follow you. What is your Twitter account?
Well, my Twitter account is an old... Yeah, my X account. It's an old it's at Will WIL underscore DA underscore Beast BEAST 630.
Will to Beast.
Yeah, Will to Beast. It's an old like hip hop label, and it's my hometown phone number.
Oh, very cool.
Hometown area code. Yeah.
Hometown AC. Yeah. Okay, well, they can get a hold of you there, and you have a website.
No. Well, actually, yeah. I'm on my collegiate website, I believe, and you can access me there.
Kentucky State University.
Well, I mean, the simplest way might just be to Google Wilfred Reilly, WILFRED REILLY. You'll find all of my books. I mean, quite a few of which have been bestsellers, at least on Amazon. Yeah. Categorically, you'll find my Twitter, Facebook, web, all that sort of stuff.
That's the beauty of the internet. You can just make a pretty simple search and find you. Well, I will tell you, I have learned a tremendous amount, have always had a lot of respect for your work. I haven't read your books, but I told you, Charles and I, obviously Charles runs one of my businesses, and I've watched you guys on video, and you guys, I don't even know if people have seen those, but you guys have some of the most amazing topics. So I'm happy you were able to participate with Goldwater with this, and we hope to have you back.